We are moving on to the next topic, the span of management. Span of control or span of management, it has got different names. So you can call it also as a span of supervision or a span of authority. Right? So what does a span of control means? It is the number of people managed effectively by a single superior in an organization. Right? So it is a better term because control and supervision are elements of management. So this carries a very, very important aspect in an organization, and it talks about the relationship between the superiors and the subordinates. If a superior is very smart enough and he has got more capacity to manage more number of subordinates, or the subordinate who are highly trained and developed, and those who are very skilled, any number of subordinates having similar quality can be supervised effectively by one single person. So that also tells about the large number of subordinates that can be managed by or supervised by a one single superior. Right? So the number of subordinates and the superior, what actually the relationship that is being identified between them is what we call a span of management or a span of control. Right? So it is difficult to decide the appropriate span of management because spans may be widely or it may be very narrow. So the situation would be a deciding factor what kind of span of control that you are going to adopt for your organization. So we have a person called V.A. Graicunos. He tells that, he says the span of control is the identified relationship that prevails between the superior and the subordinate. So you can consider this as also an definition for span of control. So determination of span of control, we have broadly three different types of prevailing relationship. So number one, there is a direct relationship, right? Direct single relationship. You can see there is superior and there are two subordinates, Y and Z, right? So it is one in which a superior has a direct relationship with his subordinates. If X supervises Y and Z, who are subordinates, there is only two single relationship, direct single relationship. X supervises Y and X supervises Z. There is no relationship between Y and Z. So this is called a direct single relationship. If we move on to a direct group relationship, in direct group relationship, a supervisor has direct relationship with his subordinates jointly. So if you see, there is also a communication between Y and Z. X discusses about, consults everything with X and Y, maybe together, jointly he can consult, but he takes the input individually, right? The next one is cross relationship. So what is a cross relationship? Cross relationship, a subordinate has relationship with another subordinate mutually. So if you could see here, there is a mutual relationship between Y and X. So there's only a superior X, but it is kind of a relationship that exists mutually between all the three. Right? So these are all the different types of relationship that exists in span of control. We had to discuss what are the major factors determining an effective span of control. So you can consider some of the factors which are mentioned here, and that has a great influence on the effective span of management. As we discussed earlier, the capacity of the superior. So any organization, a manager has a different capacity in respect to the communication, leadership, decision making, control, you can name many, right? So if the manager with more capacity, he can supervise n number of subordinates, right, effectively. So that actually determines the attitude and personality of the manager, who would contribute a major impact on the capacity of or the kind of a span of control that the management is going to decide. Second is the capacity of subordinates. So when we are discussing about the capacity of the subordinates, as we discussed earlier, they are trained, developed and experienced. So when the subordinate who are highly qualified, they don't require much supervision from a superior. So they can contribute more. So n number of subordinates can be allocated under a superior who require a very less supervision for the responsibility allocated. So the capacity of the subordinates is also an important factor deciding your span of control. Then the nature of the work. If a subordinates are involved in simple and repetitive activities, normally the manager need not supervise them. But if it is going to be more complex, right? So they need to have a very shorter span of control where the supervisor will have a direct relationship with them in case the subordinates require any assistance for the completion of task. So nature of work. Then the type of technology. So firms using mass production or assembly line, they have a very wider span because they are going to employ a batch or a process production system too. So average span for the first line supervisor, normally we have in 3 types of technology. So first one, we may have a wider span in case of mass production and assembly line, and unit or a small batch production, or a process or a continuous production. So what kind of technology you are going to adopt for the process, you determine what kind of span that you would be engaging to supervise the subordinates. Right. So if you take process and continuous production, the number of people engaged in such activities are very less compared to the mass production and assembly line. So you have to decide what kind of span of control you are going to employ. The second one is delegation of authority. So the most serious symptom of poor organization definitely will affect the span of management, because if there is unclear authority delegation, so managers cannot very effectively supervise. So the manager has to be clearly delegate the authority so that he will have a well-defined task, a well-trained subordinate. So the task, whatever has been assigned for the entire team, they can have a very effective delivery, right? So second one is the clarity of plans. So if the degree of the plan is very higher, the standing plans clearly provides rules, regulations, procedures, and methods, how you have to do the work. Then the degree of span would be very higher, right? In such cases, the subordinates can do work to their own attention, or they may not, if the plans are not accurately drawn, right, accurately or clearly, the span has to be narrow so that the subordinates require much consultation and guidelines for doing the work. So the clarity of plan, if the plan is not properly, made, it becomes very difficult for the subordinates to execute. So clear plan gives a clear, instructions for the work. Improper plan, that requires a very close relationship because subordinates would not get a clear path for the completion of the task. Next one is the communication technique. So the pattern of communication is also very, very important factor to determine the span of control, right? If the communication is oral or face-to-face, so that require more time and energy, right? Because the superior has to go meet them in person and they have to communicate. On the other hand, if we use some electronic or other modes of devices, even now we are more technological oriented for communication. Even at an education institutions, we are using WhatsApp, or we use some ERP system where the information is very quickly disseminated to the students. So that kind of a communication technique that you can have very well for the span of control, and that is one of the major contributing factor. Next, using objective standards. So the supervisors are using standards in an organization. This helps them to find the errors or faults in the performance of the work. So they need not spend more time in watching the performance. So that becomes very easy for them. Next, geographical closeness of employees. So some closer subordinates where they are very far in physical location, if it is not easy for them to contact the supervisor, where the control becomes very difficult, you have to plan accordingly your span of control to overcome such difficulties. So geographical closeness of an employee is also a very important factor that contributes to planning of appropriate span of control for an organizations. Next one is direction and coordination. So because why we need to have a span of control, that is to determine the degree of coordination, right? Maybe within the unit or with other units of other divisions. So the unit needs continuous directions, and that demands the extra time of the manager in coordinating activities. So if you have a fewer subordinates, it is easy to supervise. So that is the ultimate aim of having the span of control. So when you are discussing about the span of control, normally we have two types of span of control. One, whether you are going for a wide or you are going for a narrow span, right? So wide span of a management means when you have a large number of subordinates managed by a superior, and a narrow span means you have a few number of subordinates managed by a superior. So when will the organization have wider spans? So wider span, or we call that as the flat structure, right? With a few levels of management. So you have a MD, the managing director, then the managing director will have managers of a different functional departments, and managers will have a subordinates working for them. So you just see this is just 3 levels of span of control. So there are very less layer of the management where the information can be passed on very quickly. And if you talk about the money, it costs very less, right? The expenses that you spent on managing subordinates, the cost is very less, because it's a wider span of control, and the business doesn't spend much because the very limited layers, information is passed on very quickly. On the other hand, if you come to a tall structure, see, there is a general manager has got different department heads. Under the different department heads, you have another supervisors. The supervisors will have subordinates, and each supervisor has got a subordinates. So this is very wide, and you can find there are many layer of supervision. So what would be the advantages? See, that it comes with both advantages and disadvantages, right? Narrow span of control allows managers to communicate quickly, because there are many number of people who could very quickly take the orders, right? But it requires a high level of management skills to control many number of employees. So it has got both both merits and demerits. So tall structures normally they do not prefer, because there is more number of people employed, and that also that also makes the communication, effective communication, a big question mark. So these are all the details about how the span of control happens in an organization. So we have discussed about what is a span of control, and we have discussed about the types of relationship that exists between the superior and the subordinates, as well as we discussed about the wide and narrow span. So what would be the advantages and disadvantages of having a wider span of control and the narrow span of control.